This is the Music Halls of Fame podcast. This week we look at the case for putting Iron Maiden into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and why the Hall might not even want them in there. Plus, our Spotlight Hall of Fame is the Songwriters Hall of Fame in Los Angeles, California. Before we get going with the podcast, like everyone tells you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll know when these podcast episodes drop, which is usually every Thursday. Now, on to this week's episode. Okay, we're switching up the format a little bit this week on the podcast. We will not be honoring a year in music or a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame like we normally do every week because the nominations for the Songwriters Hall of Fame are out, and I wanted to go over them because this is a pretty solid class this year. We are going to start with our usual segment, though, about who I think should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But before we do that, since we have a lot of new members, and welcome one and all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a Gen Xer, sorry boomers, who has been involved in music, either playing or behind the scenes, since the 5th grade, which was it was a long time ago, sorry. I went to college for music education and also ran record stores for almost 10 years, and I'm still involved in music to this very day. I'm also a huge audiophile, and unlike most of my generation and also baby boomers, I can actually tolerate today's music. All right, some of it at least. Not all. Not even most. But some of it. This particular podcast actually started in audio form almost 7 years ago by now, before I started putting it out on YouTube. That's who I am, so you know that it's not just some dude giving you stupid hot takes. Okay, there's probably still stupid, but they do come from a place of knowledge at least. Now, with all that said, let us get on with things and to the business at hand, and let us talk about a group that absolutely deserves to be inducted into the Hall, Iron Maiden. They are one of those groups who I have actually been screaming about not being in ever since I started this podcast, along with Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. And despite the fact that most of their songs have never been played on the radio or on television, Iron Maiden are still one of the most successful rock acts in history, selling over 90 million records and counting. They are number 24 on the VH1 Hot 100 Greatest Artists of Hard Rock list and number 4 on the MTV Top 10 Greatest Heavy Metal Bands of All Time list. All right, so that's not good enough for the Hall? You say you want a band who's influenced others? Oh yeah, Iron Maiden's influenced plenty. Let's just start off with the obvious one, like Metallica, and then you can slide on over into Slayer, Avenged Sevenfold, Trivium, Slipknot, Fozzy, Opeth, 3 Inches of Blood, Anthrax, and the list goes on and on and on. We don't even have enough time to list all the bands who they've actually influenced. Besides, how could you not have a band who had the song Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter in the Hall? That's a serious question, by the way. I'm being very serious. How could you not have a band who had that title in? Really? Also, let us not forget about Eddie, quite possibly the coolest band mascot ever. Now, as much as there are a lot of people like myself who think that they deserve induction, and actually, they do, there's one group of people who don't want them to be inducted. That's actually the band members themselves. There is something, I guess, to be said about how cool it is to not be in the Hall. I may share my theory about that in another podcast very soon. However, here is my theory as to why the Hall does not want Iron Maiden in. It is my absolute firm belief that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, for one reason or another, hates, and I use that word purposely, hates two types of rock music: progressive rock and heavy metal. I give you, for example, look how long it took for artists like Yes and Rush and Kiss and Ozzy to finally get in. Look also at groups who should have been in decades ago but still aren't, aside from Iron Maiden, like Motorhead or Slayer. Any way you slice it, more heavy metal needs to be in the hall. They can start definitely by putting Iron Maiden in, stopping the hatred against heavy metal and progressive rock, I might add, and put Iron Maiden in next year in the class of 2025. Now, normally this would be the spot where I tell you to check this week's podcast playlist and the show notes, but since they are going to be the only official artists who we will be talking about in this episode, might I instead point you to Iron Maiden's greatest hits album, Best of the Beast, to get your feet wet with them if you have no clue as to who Iron Maiden is. And if you don't, really, seriously, where you been? Wake up. It's Iron Maiden. I mean, come on now. Bring your daughter to the slaughter. Excellent song. In any event, I have put the link to Best of the Beast in this week's show notes. Before we go any further, we'd like to tell you that there is now a Music History in Depth podcast where we go more in depth on a few of the events that happened in music history for that particular week. The Music History in Depth podcast drops every Tuesday on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from, as does our Music History Today podcast, which goes over the daily events in music history. The Music History Today podcast drops daily, including weekends, on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to this podcast. The Songwriters Hall of Fame was started in 1969 by Johnny Mercer and publishers Abe Oldman and Howie Richmond. Now Rogers of Chic is the chairman at the moment. And as of right now, the Hall of Fame is part of the Grammy Museum in Los Angeles, California. Its hours of operation are Sunday to Thursday from 10:30 to 6:30, Friday and Saturday from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., and closed on Tuesdays. There are plans to construct a permanent physical hall in the basement of the famous Brill Building in New York City. That's the building where a lot of songwriters actually plied their trade back in the day, like Simon and Garfunkel, Steely Dan, Carole King, etc., etc. Even though the exhibit for the hall is in Los Angeles, the ceremony itself is usually held at the Marriott Marquis Hotel in Times Square in New York City. For whatever reason, it is never live streamed, so there's no visual record usually of the ceremonies, just little snippets here and there, like when REM got in last year. There are normally 14 special awards that the hall gives out. Most of them are not given out every single year, though. There's also a general songwriters category that has anywhere from 5 to 12 songwriters inducted into it, depending on the year. They have since amended that, though, because this year they have just announced the new list for the songwriters. And out of all of the list, only 6 are going to be inducted this year. 3 from the 13 nominees in the Performing Songwriters category, and 3 from the 13 nominees in just your Basic Songwriters category, those guys who don't actually perform on stage. 6 inductees will be celebrated at the Songwriters Hall of Fame 2025 induction and awards gala. This next year will be on June 12th in the same place, the Marriott Marquis in New York City. All but 5 of the 26 nominees are individuals. 5 collaborators on the ballot this year are Steve Barri and P.F. Sloan, Dennis Lambert and Paul Potter, Dan Penn and Spooner Oldham. 3 members of the Doobie Brothers, Tom Johnson, Michael McDonald, and Patrick Simmons, and all 5 former members of NWA, those being Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, Ice Cube, MC Ren, and DJ Yella. Almost All of the nominees are still living. The only exceptions this time around are Sloan, who died in 2015 at the age of 70, and Eazy-E, of course, from NWA, who died of AIDS in 1995 at the age of 30. The youngest nominees this year are Ashley Gorley and Rodney Darkchild Jerkins. Both of them are 47. The list this time around also includes 4 women, 3 of whom are actually in the performers category. That would be Sheryl Crow, Janet Jackson, and Alanis Morissette, while the regular songwriters category only has 1, Franny Gold. A few songwriters already have collaborators who are in the hall this year. For instance, Walter Afanasieff, who usually collaborates with Mariah Carey. Mariah was inducted in 2022. Roger Nichols, who usually collaborated with Paul Williams. Paul Williams was inducted in 2001. Janet Jackson, of course, had Michael Jackson. Michael was inducted in 2002. Mike Love of the Beach Boys was a colleague, of course, of the great Brian Wilson, who was inducted way back in 2000. The list also includes 8 members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame: Sheryl Crow, Eminem, Janet Jackson, George Clinton, who, of course, is the leader of Parliament Funkadelic, Mike Love, who, of course, is part of the Beach Boys, and Steve Winwood, who is in The Rock because he was a member of Traffic. Also, the Doobie Brothers, the 3 guys who were nominated this year, and NWA's 5 guys. The list also includes 4 members of the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame. Sonny Curtis was inducted in 1991. Tom Douglas was inducted in 2014. Oldham was inducted in 2020. And Penn was actually only inducted last week. 3 of the nominees are actually past winners of the Grammy Award for Producer of the Year in the non-classical category. Narada Michael Walden won it in 1988 because of his work with Whitney Houston for the most part. Afanasieff won it in 2000 and Dr. Dre won it in 2001. Songwriter with a catalog of notable songs qualifies for induction 20 years after their first significant commercial release of a song. Eligible voting members have until midnight Eastern Daylight Time on December 22nd to turn in their ballots, with the choices of up to 3 nominees in each of the 2 categories. And like I said before, there was no mention of any of the other awards, at least as of right now. So, what we are going to do is we are going to go over every single nominee that we know of so far, and we will do that in the next segment. Okay, here is the complete list for the Songwriters Hall of Fame for 2025 for the nominations. We are going to start with the non-performing songwriters. The nominees are Walter Afanasieff, who wrote songs with Mariah Carey, such as All I Want for Christmas Is You, Hero, and One Sweet Day. He also wrote License to Kill and Love Will Survive. Steve Barri and P.F. Sloan come up next. They did together Secret Agent Man, Eve of Destruction, Where Were You When I Needed You, You Baby, and Get to Know You. There was also Mike Chapman, who did The Best for Tina Turner, Love is a Battlefield for Pat Benatar, Ballroom Blitz, of course, classic song, Stumbling In, that's Suzi Quatro. I remember that one. Great song. And Kiss You All Over. That has that real sly, sexy beat that kind of sneaks up on you. That's a great song. Next up is Sonny Curtis. He did Love Is All Around, which is the theme from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which is a catchy theme song. Also, Sonny Curtis wrote I Fought the Law, and the law won. Walk Right Back is also his song. More Than I Can Say is his song. I think that was Leo Sayer who did that one. Can't remember. Also, I'm No Stranger to the Rain. Sonny Curtis also wrote a lot of Nashville stuff, as I mentioned earlier. Next is Tom Douglas. Tom Douglas did The House That Built Me, Little Rock, I Run to You, Grown Men Don't Cry, and Love Me Anyway. Franny Gold is our only woman in the category. Actually, no, there's another one in there. In fact, she's coming up next. Let's get back to Franny, though. Franny did Dreaming of You, Night Shift, Don't Look Any Further, Don't You Want Me, and Stick With You. All great 90s and 2000s early century R&B songs. Ashley Gorley is the next one. She had I Had Some Help, Last Night, You Should Probably Leave, Play It Again, and You're Gonna Miss This. Then comes Rodney Darkchild Jerkins, who did the song Say My Name for Destiny's Child. The Boy Is Mine with Monica and Brandy. You Rock My World for Michael Jackson. Then there's Deja Vu and Telephone, the Lady Gaga Beyonce song. Dennis Lambert and Brian Potter come up next. They did One Tin Soldier, the theme from Billy Jack. Wow, I haven't seen Billy Jack, the movie, in, wow, it's been a while. Also, Don't Pull Your Love, Ain't No Woman Like the One I Got, It Only Takes a Minute, Girl, to Fall in Love. There's a classic. And Country Boy, You Got Your Feet in L.A. Good songs. Tony McCauley is next up. Tony did Baby Now That I Found You. Also Build Me Up Buttercup, which of course became famous again because it was at the ending of Something About Mary, the movie with Cameron Diaz and Ben Stiller. We gotta bleed her! Anyway, also Don't Give Up on Us. That was from David Soul of Starsky and Hutch fame, that is. Last Night I Didn't Get to Sleep at All. Good soon. Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes. Also a Tony McCauley song. Roger Nichols is up next. He did We've Only Just Begun, Rainy Days and Mondays, I Won't Last a Day Without You, Out in the Country, and Time of Your Life. The first couple, of course, was by the legendary group The Carpenters. Dan Penn and Spooner Oldham are next. They did I'm Your Puppet, Cry Like a Baby, A Woman Left Lonely, Out of Left Field, and It Tears Me Up. And, of course, there's Narada Michael Walden. He did How Will I Know, Freeway of Love, You're a Friend of Mine, Baby Come to Me, and Who's Zoomin' Who. Who's Zoomin' Who, of course, was Aretha Franklin. Baby Come to Me was actually the love theme from General Hospital back in the 80s that became a big hit. You're a Friend of Mine, that was Clarence Clemens and Jackson Browne, if memory serves. Freeway of Love, of course, was Aretha. And Whitney Houston was How Will I Know. And those are your nominees for the regular songwriting category. Now then, out of all of those, you only get to choose 3 to be inducted into the next class for the Hall. So, who you got? Leave me a note in the comment section. I'm curious as to which 3 you want in that group to actually make it in. This one's going to be tougher. The performing songwriters, your favorite artists, and good luck picking 3 out of this group. Let us start with Bryan Adams, who of course did Everything I Do It For You, Heaven, All for Love, Have You Ever Really Loved a Woman, Summer of '69, Cuts Like a Knife, Run to You. Man, that list goes on and on. Next, you have Boy George, of course, of Culture Club, real name George Allen O'Dowd. He did Karma Chameleon, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, Time, Clock of the Heart, Love is Love, Miss Me Blind. Also another one whose list goes long and long. Now, here's the thing about Boy George, though. Once you get past Culture Club's first 2 albums, that's kind of it for Boy George, as far as I know, except for the song The Crying Game from the movie of the same name. Other than that, that might be the strike against him, is that Culture Club was only big for maybe a few years and then not much else. Next up, though, George Clinton. Yes, a Parliament Funkadelic George Clinton has not been inducted into the Hall yet. There's one that we should scream about. In the interim, here's what he's done. Atomic Dog, Flashlight, Knee Deep, I'd Rather Be With You, Give Up the Funk, Tear the Roof Off the Sucker. I mean, come on. That's P-Funk, baby. P-Funk. And the master himself is finally going to get nominated. Maybe. Or is he? Because next up is Sheryl Crow, who did All I Want to Do Is Have Some Fun, Soak Up the Sun, If It Makes You Happy, A Change Would Do You Good, Every Day is a Winding Road. Also a solid resume for her. Next come three members of the Doobie Brothers, Tom Johnston, Michael McDonald, and Patrick Simmons. Now here's the funny thing. Michael McDonald is also a great songwriter by himself, doing stuff without the Doobie Brothers, like I Keep Forgetting. But I'm curious as to whether they would put him in as a solo songwriter as opposed to being with the Doobie Brothers. His resume, as far as being with the Doobie Brothers goes, includes Listen to the Music, Taking It to the Streets, Black Water, What a Fool Believes, and Long Train Runnin'. Also, very solid resume. Next, Mr. Marshall Mathers, Slim Shady himself, Eminem. He, of course, did Lose Yourself, Stan, Mockingbird, Houdini, Rap God, and boy, is that list long on him as well. David Gates of Bread, as everybody forgets. Love that group. Anyway, did Everything I Own, Make It With You, Baby I'ma Want You, Baby I'ma Need You. The Guitar Man, If. Also, solid resume. Janet Jackson. Janet did Black Cat, Together Again, Got Till It's Gone, and Rhythm Nation. Now, here's the strike against Janet Jackson, I would think. And that is that the vast majority of her songs were written along with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. Those two are already in the Hall. In fact, I think they got into the Songwriters Hall, I want to say maybe about 2-3 years ago, maybe something like that. So I don't know if Janet Jackson gets enough credit. So that might actually be kind of a sticking point against her, at least this year, because this is a stacked class. For instance, let's go to the next one. Tommy James, who of course did Moni Moni, Crimson and Clover, Crystal Blue Persuasion, Sweet Cherry Wine, and Tighter Tighter. Now, the great thing about a songwriter, especially if you're a performing songwriter, is that if you have songs that you made popular yourself, but then other people re-recorded them, did cover versions, and those versions got popular. For instance, Billy Idol with Moni Moni, which he took that song to #1, and Joan Jett, who took Crimson and Clover all the way into the top 10. And I think somebody else also did Crystal Blue Persuasion, but I can't remember who. But in any event, that is the real telltale of a great songwriter. Mike Love of the Beach Boys, who helped to write classic songs like California Girls, Good Vibrations, The Warmth of the Sun, I Get Around, Fun, 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 Till the Daddy Takes a T-Bird Away, blah, blah, blah. Solid resume. Next is Alanis Morissette, who did You Ought to Know, Ironic, Hand in My Pocket, Thank You, Uninvited. That list goes on and on as well. Also, the knock against Alanis is kind of the same as, well, Boy George, in that they had a couple of albums and then that's about it. That may work against her as well. Don't know. Only because of the strength of the class. Otherwise, automatic in. Next up, NWA, all five guys. Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, Ice Cube, MC Ren, DJ Yella. You got Express Yourself, you got Dope Man, you got Fuck the Police, you got Gangsta Gangsta, you got Straight Outta Compton. Solid resume, but same problem as Alanis. They were only around for a couple of albums and then that was it. So I don't know. Does longevity actually play in this whole thing? I have no idea, but it's worth looking into. Last up, the legend himself, Mr. Steve Winwood, who I could have sworn had been in this hall for the longest time, but I guess not. which is a shame. Steve Winwood's resume, aside from everything he did with Traffic, which I guess they're not counting in this, his solo stuff, Higher Love, Give Me Some Lovin', well, that's Traffic, so there we go. I'm a Man, Valerie, Roll With It. Boy, is that a long list as well. In any event, those are your 13 nominees for performing songwriters. Bryan Adams, Boy George, George Clinton, Sheryl Crow, the Doobie Brothers, Eminem, David Gates, Janet Jackson, Tommy James, Mike Love, Alanis Morissette, NWA, Steve Winwood. You can only choose 3. So which 3 you got? I honestly can't choose just 3 on this. They all deserve to get in. But the Hall only allows 3. So let me know in the comments section who you actually think should be inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. And in the show notes, I will give you this complete list so you can make a decision yourself. Also, to repeat for the non-performers songwriters, you get Walter Afanasieff, Steve Barri and P.F. Sloan, Mike Chapman, Sonny Curtis, Tom Douglas, Franny Gold, Ashley Gorley, Rodney Darkchild Jerkins, Dennis Lambert and Brian Potter, Tony McCauley, Roger Nichols, Dan Penn and Spooner Oldman, Narada Michael Walden, and that is your list. You only get 3 out of those as well. The Songwriters Hall of Fame induction ceremony will take place on June 12th at the Marriott Marquis in New York City. And December 22nd is the last day that anybody who gets to actually vote on this has to have their ballots in by. They do not say when the official announcement for next year's class inductees will be announced, but I'm assuming it will be sometime in January. So let's see out of these 26, which 6 get in. I'm rather curious myself. Also, we should mention again that you can actually visit the Songwriters Hall of Fame with its special little exhibit at the Grammy Museum, which is in downtown Los Angeles. The Music Halls of Fame podcast is part of the Music History Today network, which can be found under Music History Today on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast from. And also on our YouTube page under Music History Today. Thank you very much for listening.